Life is for enjoying. It shouldn't be about depriving yourself. As soon as you tell yourself you can't have something, you want it. So if you actually allow yourself to have a little bit of everything you fancy, then you're not going to actually feel like you're depriving yourself, and you don't feel miserable.
This is Running for Real, the podcast for runners who know that for every runner's high, there are just as many lows. All those just missed PRs, easy runs that feel hard, injury blues, and more. Each week, we'll talk to running, health, and wellness experts about their highs, lows, and best advice to build our confidence. Running for Real is about being honest, being brave, and most of all, not feeling alone. And now here's our host, who loves inspirational quote posters on the walls of her home, Tina Muir.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to episode 33 of the Running for Real podcast. I am so thankful you are here right now. I know you could be plenty of other places. You could be listening to some fun music. You could be listening to another podcast, but you are here right now. And I want to thank you for taking the time to tune in. Last week, we talked to Kelly Roberts. Now, she's kind of known for her outspoken personality and for breaking down barriers of what it means to be a runner or look like a runner. I had a lot of fun talking to Kelly, and I hope it got you thinking about the way that you view yourself and whether you're actually giving yourself enough credit for what you're doing. If you did miss that episode, make sure you go back and check it out. Now, this week, we are onto something a little bit more serious. It kind of follows on from what Kelly was saying last week about this desire we have to be thin or to be perfect. But today we're talking about orthorexia, which is also the obsession with clean or healthy eating that our society have. Now, I bet most of you either know someone who is very particular and has very rigid rules with their eating, or maybe it's you. You know, I have to admit, if it wasn't for my love of sweets, I think I wasn't far off being obsessed with my diet when I was a professional runner. But thankfully for me, those sweets helped me accept my diet was never going to be too healthy. It was never going to be perfect, and it was never going to be regimented. But it was definitely a bit of a wake-up call for me listening to this episode. Now, I want to give a warning. This episode might make you think about the way you look at your food. It might make you kind of change how you're thinking, and I would really encourage you to make sure you do speak to someone if you recognize behaviors in yourself or in some of your loved ones. Now, Renee McGregor is one of the best experts out there on this topic, so her book will definitely come in handy for you. But finding someone in your area is an absolute must, and you could be saving your life or saving another life from heading down a path that is very difficult to confront and much harder the longer you live it. So don't wait if this does sound familiar to you. So before we get on to that, I just want to say some of the side effects of this restriction to any pure and natural foods is that you can have social isolation, you can have depression, and a lot of it is we get this frustration in our running because things are just not going how we want them to, no matter how much we control things. But regardless of where you're at in your running, getting your fueling right within the run itself can go a long way. You know, we are talking about the rest of your life, but none of us want to, feel bad in a run, know that we didn't get our fuel correct. And we don't really want those sticky, nasty gels that are literally pure processed sugar. Those aren't good in anyone's book, whether you're eating well or not. So I wanted to mention that Generation UCAN is a product you can take before and during a race that doesn't have those sugar highs and the crashes. And it only contains ingredients your body will actually find helpful and will help you sustain your energy. So later in the episode, I'll tell you how you can get 15% off your order at generationucan.com. By now, you know me, and I pride myself on being honest. There are a few brands that I talk about more than Body Health, and there's good reason for that. Body Health Perfect Amino helped me recover through my toughest training segments and helped me get to race day fit and healthy. Use coupon code RUNNINGFORREAL for 10% off at bodyhealth.com. Renee, thank you so much for joining me on the Running for Real podcast. I feel extremely honoured that I've managed to grab you just a few weeks before your book launch, although this interview will be coming out just after, I think. So thank you so much for fitting us in. This is such a relevant topic today, and I appreciate you giving us some time.
Oh, I'm really pleased to be here. So, no problem at all.
Okay, great. And for those listeners, Renee and I talked, maybe it was early this year or late last year. And, Renee was in the middle of, finishing up the book, and I was excited about it at the time. And, we just connected straight away, just were on the same page for a lot of things. And so I'm very excited that Orthorexia, When Healthy Eating Goes Bad, is now a book officially.
Yes.
And I am sure a lot of our listeners will be purchasing it after this interview, either because a lot of things resonate within themselves, or they see some other things in other people that they care about and they want to do something about it. So firstly, let's talk about orthorexia, kind of a new term that's come out. Some people listening, I'm sure, haven't even heard of it. But what made you decide to kind of go for this topic rather than kind of writing about like nutrition as a whole?
I think, I suppose my path in nutrition, the two areas that I tend to specialize in are sports nutrition and eating disorders. And more and more and more, I was finding that there was a big overlap in the two. And then with all the hype around different books that have been coming out, written by bloggers and stuff around clean eating and different food fads, it kind of made sense to just get some real accurate information out there. And I think for me, it sort of stemmed from about this time last year when I was invited to the Cheltenham Literature Festival to be on a panel. It was basically a panel about the debate on clean eating. And I was brought in with B. Wilson and Madeline Shaw, and I'm literally my role was to be the scientist behind clean eating and what it was and does it really exist and everything. And it was during that experience where actually I realised just how bad it had got, how bad the situation was, and it was actually a very difficult experience. And I know some of your listeners may well have read my blog on it, but I know Bee's written quite openly about it in a few articles.
So can I just pause you there? Were you brought in kind of like almost, I don't want to say encouraging it, but like this is how you should be doing it, and it was like a realization of, oh wow, like actually this isn't kind of where I wanted to go? Or like how were you brought into this at that moment? Was it kind of pro that kind of way of eating or against
No,
it?
very much against it. So I was very much brought in as the please can you explain the kind of the negative aspects of clean eating, because it almost has become this very evangelistic eating. And we had Madeline Shaw on the stage, who was obviously very pro clean eating, and B was kind of fairly neutral, but actually transpired that she had obviously read the books and actually was pretty anti it. So it was an interesting mix of people, to be fair. And I suppose my voice was very much actually saying the reason why it's such a bad way of the reason why it's so bad, why the term can be misguiding, why while I have absolutely no doubt that people like Madeline, they don't write these things with any intent. They're not meant to be, they're not trying to be malicious. They're not trying to be difficult. They're not trying to create problems. I think the problem is that because they come from an area where they have absolutely no knowledge, what they've done is create almost something that's validating poor eating behaviors to those that are quite vulnerable. That's the only way I can describe it. And I was very, very open on stage saying, I do not blame clean eating. I do not blame social media. I do not blame individuals for a rise in eating disorders. However, what they have to realize is that they do have a responsibility, and there's people out there who are very vulnerable, and an eating disorder is very much about having a very low sense of self. And so when you're somebody like that, you are going to be constantly looking for answers and constantly looking for things that are going to make you try and feel better. But whatever you do is never enough. I think we both know that whatever you do is never enough. But in this case, because the whole clean eating thing is very much promoted by people that are very beautiful, they're very good at selling themselves on social media. They're selling a lifestyle. Of course, people look at that and go, "I want a bit of that." Of course, they do.
Yeah.
It's a no-brainer. I'm not going to sit here and say I've never done it. I've looked at some of those posts thinking, "Oh my God, how has she managed that? How has she managed to create that cake, do yoga, and put a podcast together?" I've no idea. I can't do it. Quite literally, I do sometimes think, "Oh, they're superwomen." but I think for me that's the thing. It was actually just trying to describe to people that it's not all it seems to be.
Yes. Yeah. And I definitely want to go into that deeper a bit later, and even, down to what you have found out in your research about things not being as they seem. And, I personally even recognize some of what you were saying myself in, over the last few years as I was trying to quietly, I know you know all about my amenorrhea issues. I talked to you about it when we talked last year. While I was trying to figure things out, I was testing things. Like I went low carb unintentionally in the end, but I just tried to increase my fat and protein and all that. And I did it, and, it went well for a while and then kind of crashed and burned. But I noticed that people were like, oh, I'm going to do that. And it was only this year really when I came out with my story that I realized that people were like seeing me doing things and being like, oh, I'm going to try that. And I was kind of taken aback, like, I'm not the expert here. Like, don't follow me. Like, listen to, if you need help, like speak to the experts. Like, I can't tell you the answer to these questions, because I realized that people were kind of looking to me for advice. And I was like, I don't have any qualifications to be saying any of this. So it can easily happen. And, when we are in our vulnerable state and someone we look up to kind of says to or says aloud, like, this is what I did, of course you're going to want to kind of learn from them and do what they do. So, like you said, I've had the same thoughts about a lot of the big time people, thinking like, oh, I want to be like them, or, if I do like they do, then I'll look like them. And we'll go into that in a bit. But just for someone listening who's kind of a bit taken aback by, we're talking about clean eating here and how it's not necessarily as good for us as it might seem. So for someone listening thinking, well, what is wrong with eating healthy food? I mean, surely that's how we want to be. Like, you kind of described it as essentially a form of self-harm if you take it too far. But what would you like to say to people who are kind of like, well, surely this is better than any alternatives of, eating fried chicken every day or going on a juice cleanse? Like, what would you like to say about that?
I think the problem is the term healthy eating can be interpreted in so many ways, and this is where the problem lies. So whenever I do a workshop or a presentation, or I'm asked to talk at a conference, one of the first things I set people is, okay, well, what does healthy eating mean to you? And you get thrown all sorts of answers, and often it is about you'll always hear someone say, oh, low carb, or having juices, or doing a detox, and you get this wherever I go, and I've done hundreds of these presentations now, and you get it, and my heart starts to sink a little bit, because I know that actually healthy eating for me, when I'm teaching people with disordered eating and dysfunctional relationships with food, healthy eating, when I'm educating them, is actually about unrestrained eating. It's actually about understanding that, majority of the time, of course, we want you to eat well. We want you to have whole grains. We want you to have fruit and vegetables. We want you to eat dairy. But we want you to include everything in your diet. That does mean that actually, if you fancy a piece of cake, or you want a bowl of ice cream, or you want a glass of wine, you don't beat yourself up about it. And I think the thing that is really striking about orthorexia in particular is that you can't do any of those things. You can't. It's so restricted. You're almost, they're very evangelistic about what they're doing, and there's so much anxiety in kind of moving away from their food rules. So they start to become isolated. They start to be unable to kind of fit in with their peers, because they can't go out on social activities because they're fearful of what they might have to eat, and I think for me that's really sad, because my first introduction, I think the first few words of my introduction of orthorexia is food, glorious food. I mean, when I was a kid, that saying from Oliver Twist was like a big thing. I remember the song, and it was just, when I was writing the introduction, I was thinking, oh my God, that's the perfect line for this book, because it should be food, glorious food. But actually it almost feels like everybody's so fearful of food now. They don't know what they should have, or is that right? And should I do it? And there is really, yes, there are some, very clear cut, eat less of this, eat a bit more of that, but there's no real right or wrong. It's very much about what's right for you as an individual. Yeah. But the problem is when people take it to the extreme that they don't allow themselves certain food groups, or like I said, it gets to the point where it causes so much anxiety they can't even just do everything, day-to-day activities. For me, that's really sad, because food is about social activity. It's about sitting around a table. It's about having a conversation. It's about enjoying that companionship and that relationship with your friends and family, and food takes a central part in that. And I think if you're anxious about food, you can't relax in those conversations either. No.
And you did talk about that in the book about having a meal out has kind of been ruined by this like love affair with clean eating. And what would you say to someone who says, well, it's not so much that I don't want to go out, but it's that my friends will judge me on what I get? Like, is that still, anyone who is like self-conscious about that is something like, hey, this should send off a red flag? Or, can it just be a situation where you have friends, probably not people you want to continue in your life if they are kind of judging you that much, but what about if it is friends passing judgment that makes you feel, too self-conscious to want to go out?
I think one of the things I would always say to people is, remember this, your perception. You can only ever know what's going on for you. You actually have no idea what somebody else is thinking. So if you're going into a situation where you believe you're going to be judged, you have to know that is truth before you can actually understand that. And so, I've got 2 daughters, and I'll often say this phrase to them, and you can see them roll their eyes at me now, but actually they use it a lot. But it is, actually you can never change somebody else's perception, but you can change your own perception of a situation. So if you're somebody who's worried about judgment, actually you have to reframe that and go into a situation going, do you know what? It's my decision, it's my life, and I enjoy this, so I'm going to eat it. And that's how you have to move forwards.
Okay, that's helpful. And then, I don't know if this is just my personal experience, but I find if you do make quite a bold decision like that, like I'm having this, like be the first one to speak up and say, I'm having this. Other people might kind of be like, oh, yeah, good for you. I'm gonna actually get the same thing. Like, so it might actually kind of help influence the rest of the group if the behaviors are typically unhealthy. So that's obviously one thing that we have to kind of think about with orthorexia, but it is, so difficult to diagnose. And that's one of the, things you talked about in the book and just in general when people talk about orthorexia. But what kind of signs should we be looking for, or should someone listening kind of listen for kind of red flags that maybe things have gone a little bit too far with diet?
Yeah, and you're so right, Tina. I mean, orthorexia is probably one of the most difficult eating disorders to diagnose, because actually it doesn't usually involve extreme weight loss like it would with anorexia. It doesn't involve purging like you would with bulimia. And so sometimes people can actually look very, very well. But the red flags for me would be very much when they can't ever deviate from their set rules, very much so. And you might not pick it up the first time, but if you're inviting a friend out for coffee or or dinner, and they're constantly making excuses, or they're like, okay, well, maybe I'll meet you after dinner, you can start to pick up that they're not comfortable. The other thing is they'll probably start to talk about food quite a lot, usually find, and they'll talk about the latest thing that they found that's really great for their health, and that's what they will actually believe has contributed to their skin glowing, like whether it's goji berries or I don't know, coconut oil or whatever the latest fad is. They'll go in search of that, and they will spend huge amounts of money on food in order for it to be right. In their mind, it has to be right. You might find the more extreme it becomes, because it does become more and more extreme, because the more they start to restrict, unfortunately, obviously, one of the real negatives of an eating disorder, one of the real problems of an eating disorder, should I say, is that you never know when enough is enough, because nothing is ever enough. You're constantly in search of trying to be better. And so, unfortunately, for some people, that can become even more restrictive and more restrictive. Or, it might start with, I'll remove sugar, then it'll be, I'll remove gluten, then it'll be, I'll remove grains, then it'll be, I'll remove dairy, and so on and so on. And so that is when it does start to then affect the physical health, because then things like hair, nail, skin, energy, breath, digestive system, all that becomes affected. And so you'll be able to start to then see the physical signs. But to start with, it's very much around those kind of real extreme food rules.
Okay. And then another thing you noted was about, the sense of superiority. And for someone listening who's saying, okay, maybe I have some of those symptoms you just mentioned, but I'm eating all these good foods. I'm fueling my body with so much good nutrition, and why would I want to put anything bad into my body when I could be giving it good food? What about that kind of pureness, the superiority that people might feel? Or maybe even if it's a friend or a family who someone is noticing these symptoms, it's difficult to kind of speak to them because they might think you're trying to sabotage them. So what can you say about that?
I mean, I think I'd always go back to, I haven't got a problem with people believing that they're eating really, really well. They probably are. But actually, when do you take a break from it? When do you actually allow yourself to join in with the rest of the world? Is the bottom line. I mean,
good point.
I probably say I do. I'm a dietitian. I eat well majority of the time, but I do also eat chocolate, have ice cream, eat cake, because actually those things are important for me to actually with my friends and family. So to me, that equally is important as putting in those good things that I put into my body.
Okay. And then if someone listening saying, okay, well, I'm doing the same thing as you, I'm eating really, really healthy all day, but then I have, sweets, chips, unhealthy food in the evening. Like, do I fall into that category, or is that person kind of, okay, that's a balance, even if it is kind of one extreme to the other? How do they fit in? I mean, it is balanced, but then it's also not. I mean, that's a very contradictory statement to make. But what I mean by that is the other thing you sometimes find, particularly in eating disorders, more so in anorexia when they're in that recovery phase than in orthorexia, but is that they're very restrictive in their intake during the day. So they'll try and eat well, is very controlled during the day, and then evening they're so hungry. But they've also kind of in their mind gone, well, actually, I've hardly eaten anything all day today, so now I'm allowed to eat. Then you find that that's when they'll eat more, basically. Okay. All right. And then what about exercise? How does that play into this? Like you said that it's not kind of the same as the other eating disorders in that, the weight isn't necessarily, as low. But does exercise kind of come into this? Yeah, absolutely. Because I think exercise, again, we all know that we promote it. It's good for the heart. It's good for the health. We should all be doing it. But again, it's something that can become very extreme. And I think one of the things I've become very observant in is the majority of athletes I work with, I see more of these kind of extreme behaviors, because actually, you have to be fairly extreme to push yourself, the limits you push yourself to do the training you have to do, to have the discipline to do what you have to do. Not a problem. The problem obviously is that extreme behavior is also what we mimic, and you can mimic and see it in people with eating disorders, because again, it's that strive for something. You do almost anything to achieve that. And so exercise will always play part in an eating disorder, because it becomes very much part of the process in terms of, well, I have to exercise to burn calories, or I have to exercise because that's the only way I'm going to get the body I want, or, so with orthorexia, it might be more aesthetic, whereas with anorexia, it's much more about calories and control. And same with bulimia, it's much more about calories and control. And I think one of the things you have to be very, very careful about, and I've had this discussion a lot with coaches recently, is when you've had somebody with an eating disorder coming back into a sport, you have to remember that they're probably not as recovered mentally as you think they're going to be. And so often what you find is what they were doing with food, that they'll transfer their anxieties and their need for control from food onto exercise. So while they can run, while they can train, while they can do the sessions they want to do, life is good. They'll keep eating, everything will be fine. As soon as they get injured, or as soon as they're ill, or something happens that means they can't do the session they need to do, the anxiety kicks in, the restrictive behaviors kick in again. So it's still very much a very angst-ridden behavior. Okay. So if someone recognizes that, maybe they thought things were going well and then got injured and kind of just spiraled out of control with, negativity and this isn't fair. What am I going to do? I'm trying so hard. And then, the temptation of those kind of restrictive behaviors comes along. Is that something that someone needs to work with, a professional there? Or, surely it's not just a case of, I'll just kind of deal with it and get over the injury, because it doesn't quite work like that.
No, absolutely. I think if you are recognizing that you're struggling, if you're injured or you can't train for whatever reason, then you definitely need to get some help. And I think psychologists and counselors are definitely your best fit for that, because again, it all comes back down to the need for controlling the anxiety. And the anxiety is usually fueled by that negative sense of self, that inability to like themselves, the inability to be self-compassionate. So when they're training, it's almost like while they feel good, it's almost like they're cracking a whip. It's almost like, it's almost like, well, you got to keep going. Even if you're tired, you got to keep going. You got to keep going. You got to keep going. And so that also helps to control that anxiety. It dumbs it down. But obviously, once you don't have that, suddenly all these feelings become available. They're all overwhelming. And it's that discomfort, the feeling of, I think we've all had times where we feel anxious, and feeling anxious is a horrible, horrible feeling. And I actually suffer with anxiety quite a lot, and it's horrible. It's like I was doing some work yesterday, and I was waiting for a call that I was quite nervous about. And the 10 minutes before the call was due, I could really feel that sense of anxiety rising within me. And I was really struggling with it. It's a very uncomfortable feeling. So obviously everybody wants to try and stop that feeling. But the reality is you can never stop that feeling. You can never put a lid on it. You have to learn to manage it. You have to learn to understand that anxiety is part of life. And actually, you are going to have times where you feel uncomfortable. That discomfort will pass, but you have to believe it will pass, and you have to think about what you can do to help it pass. So in my case, actually, I was with a friend, and I mentioned to a friend, I'm really anxious, I'm a bit stressed out. And they put on just a really chilled out song. And actually that really helped. I know that sounds silly, but actually for me at that moment is exactly what I needed. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's good. I can concentrate on something else. Sometimes I do yoga. Sometimes I read a book. Sometimes I go for a walk. Sometimes I just sit with it and accept that I have to feel like this. And, before I do presentations, people always say to me, you always seem really calm and in control. I'm not. I don't, believe it or not, I really don't like being in front of the camera. I don't like being center of attention in any formal manner. I find it all very difficult. But obviously, equally, because I'm passionate about what I do and I want people to benefit from it and learn from it, I know I have to put myself through it to do it. So I think with going back to the exercise thing, if you are somebody that struggles with it and you're really feeling that you can't eat because you're not training, or you're just feeling very, very uncomfortable in your sense of self because that will be anxiety, then I would really highly recommend you try and find someone to talk to. I mean, if you're an elite athlete, a high performance athlete, you may find that there's somebody within your team that you can ask. There's usually sports psychologists. If you're somebody that is maybe not at that level, but actually still does a lot of exercise, then I would definitely go to your GP first and see if you can get something through them. But if not, then look at some private support, definitely.
And you did give some good information in the book about how to know which type of therapist is best for, you and your situation. And so that was really helpful. And I think people will appreciate that if, this is kind of ringing true for you. And you mentioned, a lot of this kind of comes down to not liking oneself or not feeling good about yourself. And you gave kind of 4 factors as kind of the causes of orthorexia. So maybe you could kind of talk about each of those just briefly about, some things that someone might be able to think about as maybe something that could have triggered this kind of need to control the eating so much that they could maybe start to kind of reflect on and consider what it could be. Yeah,
I mean, I think any eating disorder comes from your experience, and it also comes from your experience of a situation. So one of the things we know about people that are more susceptible to eating disorders is that they do tend to be a certain type of person. So they do tend to be more susceptible and vulnerable and probably quite sensitive to situations. So, for example, it could be that you are somebody that has had a traumatic relationship, in that you have never appreciated that because of your sense of self-worth, you have done pretty much anything or everything to try and please the other person in that relationship. And actually, that other person has been quite a negative influence on you. And so your sense of self never improves. So you're constantly sort of reminding yourself that you're not good enough for that. But again, a lot of that's about your perceptions. And I think that's the biggest thing around an eating disorder. A lot of it is so much around perceptions of yourself. It will also be around experiences, like you could have very early on experiences, perhaps as a young child, something happened to you, or you experienced bullying, and that in itself might trigger this inner critic to start saying, well, you're bullied because you're not good enough, or you're this, or you're that, and it's about that kind of, again, that very negative narrative that goes on in your mind, so that every situation that from then on in, you see it in that negative way rather than being able to see it in a positive way. So, I mean, that's kind of, they're kind of the key ones in terms of, a lot of it is around your interpretation of things that have happened. But the problem is often it's an unconscious thing. You don't realize it. You don't realize that that's what's happening, probably until you're too late down that road, if that makes sense. Like, I hope that actually people listening to this would go, do you know what, that's me. I always see myself in that way, or I can never see myself in a positive light, and nothing's ever good enough, and I'm never good enough. And I hope people will think about that and realize that actually we are all good enough, and we have to accept that we're also all where we are. And you can only compare yourself to yourself. You can't really compare yourself to anybody else. And we all do it. We all compare ourselves to somebody else and think they're prettier, they're more intelligent, they're more successful. But actually, you can only compare yourself to yourself. And I tend to, when I get into a bit of a frenzy, sometimes I go, do you know what? Okay, so if I compare myself to where I was a month ago, I'm not doing too badly. And that's one way of looking at it. If I compare myself to 5 years ago, actually, I'm in a much better place than I was. And so that's one of the ways to kind of to help yourself in that way.
Yeah. No, I think that's helpful. And, that leads on perfectly to one of the things I wanted to talk about at some point, and we can talk about it now, was you said about comparison, only compare to yourself. But, at the beginning, you kind of mentioned about social media and how you don't think social media is to blame. But does social media in this kind of situation make things worse or better? Like, is it reinforcing kind of those negative behaviors by continuing to show you other people who are, maybe doing what you consider better than you, or maybe, they have things that you don't have? How does social media play into it? Absolutely.
I think social media definitely contributes to that negative narrative. I think social media can also be brilliant. Like, I honestly believe it can be, it's kind of, you can have the best of both. But I think when you're somebody who's going through a bad patch, or you're feeling very, very low, or vulnerable, then actually it's more harmful than good. And I'll give you an example. My 14-year-old daughter had a bit of a rough time at the end of her school year last year. And we had, a long discussion about what was going on. And in the end, she said, Mum, I'm going to come off social media because it's not helping me, because I basically base my sense of self around how many likes I have or what someone said about me.
You hear that often.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I said, you know what? I understand it's difficult because everybody, especially the teenage population, they converse over social media. That's how they communicate with each other. So it's difficult. If you decide to come off Snapchat and Instagram, you have no way of communicating with your friends because they won't actually pick up the phone. They won't actually answer a text message, as I learned, from talking to her. But she came off it for the whole summer, and she felt so much better just being able to rebuild herself and rebuild her confidence and realize that it didn't matter what anybody else thought of her, because actually she was comfortable with who she was. And I just feel like from my point of view as a mother, that was a lesson, a really good lesson she learned from herself, but also I was very proud of her for taking that step. And and I think anybody, even if you're the most confident person in the world, I mean, I've gone through a very difficult year. I'm just separated from my husband of 15 years. So it's been a very difficult year. And I've had moments where I've actually come off social media too, because I'm like, I can't, because I'll look at that and I just think because of where I'm at, because I don't feel good about myself, I'll look at those images or I'll look at that tweet and think, oh, I'm just not good enough. I'm not where I should be. And actually just coming off it again has helped you to rebuild yourself and realize that that's just your perception. And also the other big thing is that social media is just a snapshot of somebody's life. It's not always reality, as I learned to find out.
Yeah, tell us about that. Like with, some of the Instagram and blog stars who you've kind of learned researching that they weren't exactly telling the truth, or maybe distorting things slightly when they were posting things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I learned a lot about people that were, they would promote their green juice in the morning and then literally it would be poured down the sink. It was so disgusting. But yet, they had projected that, they had promoted it to however million followers they had, and everybody's thinking, oh, I need to have a green juice to start my day. That's what I need to do. And actually, quite honestly, I haven't yet. I personally, I can be proven wrong, but I personally have not yet tasted a green juice that I think is worth getting out of bed for. So, but there's that. Then there's also, it's interesting. There was a program, a Horizon program, and Giles Yayo, he did a brilliant interview with a very well-known blogger, and she openly admitted on telly that, well, yeah, I have to take the photos quite a few times and I need to make it look pretty. It wasn't necessarily that they ate it. It just had to look pretty because it's promoting what it is. So I think, that's the other thing, is that with smartphones and everything else, you can add filters, you can change things, you can make it look amazing, you can make yourself look amazing, even when you're feeling rubbish. And so I think I always say to the people I work with who will, I had a lovely girl I was working with, and she really is a beautiful, beautiful young lady, a really beautiful young lady. And what made me so sad was she came into my clinic room and we were chatting, and she said, the problem is, Renee, I really want to do what you're telling me to do, but when I compare my breakfast to such and such breakfast, it's not the same, and I don't feel like I can. I mean, it was as simple as that. It was that she just felt so unable to follow a balanced nutrition plan because it wasn't what was being promoted by social media. And I'm like, yeah, but you don't actually know that person's eaten that. How do you know that? And it was only when I said that, she was like, oh yeah, you've got a really good point there. And she just hadn't thought that through. So yeah, I think social media definitely can be positive, but it can also be very negative. And I think,
take it with a pinch of salt.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there's a few things from that I've noticed. One, I remember reading an article a few years ago, it was probably 10 years ago now, but it was about Jessica Simpson, and it said about how, she would eat one bite of a piece of cake and then throw the rest away. And then, that always stuck with me, because I thought, she's putting up, this delicious chocolate cake, and she's eating one piece and then throwing it, one bite and then throwing the rest away. So people are thinking, well, if she can eat chocolate cake, then I can eat chocolate cake. And then, not that that's a bad thing as we're discussing right now, but, that's what it looked like, that she was eating the whole thing, but really she was only eating one bite. And then the other thing, when my sister gave birth to her baby last year, or this year, she said to me, everyone's posting all this positive stuff about having a baby and how good it is and how amazing their baby is. And I'm just struggling so much. And I kind of said to her, like, look at your social media. All you've put up is how much you love your baby and how amazing everything is. So you're doing the exact same thing. And we're all guilty of it. I force myself every now and again to put up something where I'm kind of admitting that I'm struggling with something, just because, I feel like that I shouldn't be hiding that when I am feeling it. But when I do that, people are 10 times more engaged because they're like, thank you for actually being honest. And so I think it is difficult to kind of share those moments, because why would you? You don't want to be that whiny person. But we need to remember that, there's so much going on behind the scenes that you might not see. So
yeah.
Thank you for kind of explaining that. And I want to go into some specifics just a little bit, because you mentioned, can't remember if we've already discussed this or if it was just in the book, but it said about, low carb is almost always present kind of in this situation. Like, what is it about low carb? It's easy for people to say, oh, I feel better that way. And I can personally say when I accidentally kind of ended up low carb, I felt pretty good for a while. So why is low carb such a, pivotal point in this kind of change in people's lives?
So I think the first thing to explain is that I think the reason why a lot of these fads are based around low carb is because carbs have been given such a negative press. Like, we've gone from blaming fat for heart health to now blaming carbs for heart problems. And the reality is, it's not carbohydrate per se, but it's the type of carbohydrate you eat and the portion sizes you eat. And so again, something I always do in all my presentations and workshops is kind of get people to look at different types of carbs and give me their feedback on which one they think has got more carbs in it. And so I'll put things up like jelly babies and raisins and potatoes. And potatoes are always like, that's the one that's got the highest carbohydrate in it. Yeah. And actually I say to them, okay, it's not. And here's the thing. So if I had given you all a bag of jelly babies when you entered the room, by now we're sort of 30, 40 minutes into the presentation, you would have completely finished that bag of jelly babies. And they're all like, yeah, definitely. And the rest. And, they would have consumed in the region of 160 grams of carbohydrate and not thought about it, not even, flinched. And yet, I say to them, okay, well, if I now have to give you the equivalent number of potatoes, that would be in the region of 3 to 4 medium potatoes. And so you can see, if you eat the right type of carbohydrate, actually you can't overconsume carbs, but it's very, very easy to overconsume the wrong types of carbohydrate. And that's where this has come about, in that people are so fearful about the fact that carbohydrates make you fat. I mean, that's just been that common mantra for several years now, but there's no truth in it at all. At the end of the day, putting on weight is all about calories in and calories out. And yeah, obviously, if you tend to eat the wrong types of carbohydrate, you will probably overconsume calories. It's a no-brainer. The reason why protein is so positive is because protein does help to keep you fuller for longer, so you don't eat as much. And so, yes, it does have that real kind of satiating effect. And so that's why it works. If you have a diet that's very high in protein, you're not going to feel quite as hungry, so you don't eat as much. So actually, again, it comes down to your calorie intake is lower. Simple math, simple science. So with the carbohydrate, I think the reason why people tend to feel better to begin with is that, firstly, as soon as you kind of remove all the kind of processed carbs, and I use that term very, very loosely, because again, I think people get confused about what processed and what it is. So to me, a bag of white pasta or a bag of white rice is not processed. It is still just carbohydrate. It's complex carbohydrate. It's a pure food from my point of view. What I see as processed are things like, when you buy ready-made meals, so, pizzas or burger buns with burgers in them, or biscuits, cakes, the sort of things you would buy in the shop that might have additional ingredients that, they've had to add in to process it, to maintain it in terms of preservation. So those are the things. So then they're also the things that actually, our bodies will consume and will want more of, because again, most of those foods also hit your dopamine spot. So as soon as you eat something that gives you a dopamine hit, you want more because it makes you feel good. And again, it becomes easier to overconsume. So when you say to yourself, right, I'm not going to eat carbohydrate, obviously you remove all those, but you also move the good stuff. And so to start with, you will feel better because you've removed the carbohydrates that probably aren't giving you much apart from energy. They're not giving you any other nutrition. After a time, obviously you then start to realize that you might not be able to think as clearly, or you have very low energy, or it affects your digestive system, because actually the body does need carbs. And if you base your intake on whole grains, you're not going to have any problems. So For me, when I'm re-educating people, it's not that carbs are bad. No food group, no one food group is to blame for anything. It is a multifactorial system, and it's actually about understanding that your body needs something from every food group to perform well.
Yeah.
Similarly, when you're working with athletes, they all panic about carbs and they all hear about insulin, and if you have an insulin spike, you're going to store fat. But insulin is a really important hormone for athletes because insulin is anabolic. So when you've done a really hard training session, what do you want to do? You want to basically improve your uptake of nutrients so that you can rebuild muscle, you can restore your carbohydrate intake so you can train again the next day. So without insulin, you can't do that. And so you do need to have carbohydrates in your system, particularly after training, in order to encourage insulin, which will then draw those nutrients into the body. So again, it's just kind of helping people to understand that a lot of the statements that have been made out there have been made by people that have very little understanding of nutrition and biochemistry. And it's been more anecdotal. Oh, I didn't eat this and I feel great. Brilliant. It worked for you, but there's no science behind it. It's not credible.
Okay. And then, so related to that, you've kind of given us some things on why you do need carbs. And you mentioned one thing you said, which I really kind of liked, and I thought maybe you could explain, is that food, isn't simply power to the muscles. What if people are saying, well, I'm eating enough carbs to get by. I'm eating sweet potatoes and I'm eating lots of, root vegetables or whatever. Like I'm eating enough for my body, but enough for my body to handle my training. Why do I need anything else?
I mean, again, it comes down to enjoyment. Life is for enjoying. It shouldn't be miserable. It shouldn't be about depriving yourself. As soon as you tell yourself you can't have something, you want it. So if you actually allow yourself to have a little bit of everything you fancy, then you're not going to actually feel like you're depriving yourself, and you don't feel miserable. Because I think as soon as for me, food is very emotive, and we know that it's such an emotive subject. And so training hard, doing well in your performance, they're all really, really important. But equally, so is actually being able to have a bit of downtime and enjoying friends' company, actually being kind to yourself. Actually, if you want something, have it. It's not going to kill you. And I think the problem is obviously when that becomes habit and you're doing it all the time, like you're doing it 4 times a day or constantly, that then obviously, yes, you have to sort of say, actually, maybe this is me being a bit over compassionate. But actually, I think when people deprive themselves and stop themselves from eating some of the things that they might actually quite like, even if it's just a one-off, then they're not allowing themselves to be compassionate and self-caring. And for me, that's a wrong.
But what if someone says, okay, but, I love pizza.
Mm-hmm.
Pizza is something that I really enjoy. It makes me happy. So can I eat pizza every day for, dinner every single day? Like what about someone who's saying they're worried that if they kind of let up on allowing themselves to have it, that they kind of like Pringles, you won't be able to stop once you kind of start.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I would definitely have to say that variety is so important. So regardless of whether it was pizza or even if it was sweet potato and, I don't know, smoked mackerel pate, I would never recommend anybody eat the same thing every single day because you need variety. The body needs variety. So that would be one aspect of it. And the other thing is, I would never say that, like I said, I never put any food off limit, but it's about explaining to them what will they gain from having pizza every day. Yes, it makes you happy, but there might be other foods that make you happy. When are you going to try those? It's not just about having one food that makes you happy all the time. It's kind of understanding that you might need a variety of different things.
Okay. And then, so on the other side of the fence, someone, you said it makes you happy, it is enjoyable. What about someone who says, well, I want, we say zucchini in the US, but,
courgette.
Obviously like courgette in England. I want to use courgette noodles instead of pasta noodles. And I think they taste absolutely delicious, better than pasta noodles. But you kind of explained that it's, even though it's, quote unquote healthier choice, considered by most people, it's actually not necessarily the case. And it would actually be better for you to reduce your portion size than maybe to keep substituting vegetables instead of carbs.
Yeah, because I think the thing is, you're tricking your mind into thinking you've had carbs. Is the bottom line. And you're trying to trick yourself into thinking you've had carbs. The problem is that while courgettes or zucchini, or spiralized courgettes or whatever you want to call them, may fill you up temporarily, you are going to get hungry later on because you haven't got the energy in there, you haven't got the whole grain in there. And then the problem starts is then you start to feel like a sense of failure because you're like, well, I'm still hungry. I need to eat something again. And it might be that actually that triggers you to eat something that you perhaps deem as unhealthy. And as soon as you open that door, it's like, well, I've messed up now, so I might as well carry on. And then you can get into a really negative kind of binge restrictive cycle, which you really don't want to go down. But I see it so much. I see people that will eat big plates of spiralized courgette with, a vegetable-based sauce. And then at 9 o'clock, they're ravenous and they can't stop because they're so hungry. And the body, while the body is feeling restricted, it has that threat of starvation, because that's pretty much what you're doing. What it will do is when food becomes available, it will eat it to excess. And so you then get into this really negative cycle where you can't regulate your eating because you then overeat in the evening, you feel bad in the morning, so then you over-restrict again, and then it happens again. So until you regulate your eating and allow yourself the foods that your body actually needs, and the threat of starvation has disappeared, only then actually will you know what your body wants when it wants it. And actually you'll probably also find what your normal weight is as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's such good advice. And actually, I wonder if the listeners can kind of hear some of that resonating with what Nancy Clark is pretty much exactly what she was saying in the interview I did with her earlier this year. And I've worked with Nancy, and my weight ended up kind of sitting about 10 to 15 pounds heavier than what I was, but it was actually the weight where I was healthy, my cycles were working, everything was good as a teenager. Yeah. So that's obviously where my body wanted to be. So I think this is good. And if someone, listening is recognizing signs and this episode is just really ringing true, what can they do to stop themselves getting further into this? Does this have to be something that a professional needs to help you with? And if so, where can they find that person? You specifically mentioned not the internet, so maybe explain that and where they can find help if needed.
So to answer your question, I think if you are somebody that this is really resonating with, then to be fair, you could try and do it yourself. You can, but I do think a bit of support is always helpful, particularly because as we've talked about throughout this podcast, a lot of this is about your sense of self and your sense of self-worth and not being able to show yourself self-compassion. So being able to learn about that and understand why is it that you can't do that, and actually, get some insight into maybe what's happened and why you do turn on yourself so much, and then being able to move forwards and change that mindset. And it's almost like having to rewire your brain and turn negative narratives into positive narratives that are going on inside your brain. So I think definitely psychological support, counselling support is really, really important. And I suppose the first port of call in the UK would be go to your GP, talk about what you're experiencing, ask them what they can provide you. Every GP practice in this country is different because it will depend on what's available within that area. But there will be something out there. There's usually some sort of, even if it's to start with, it's an online CBT type course, there will be something out there that can at least give you some initial support. Similarly, there are some really good phone lines. I mean, I work part-time for a national eating disorder charity called Anorexia and Bulimia Care, and we are one of the only eating disorder charities that has helplines open 9 to 5 every day, Monday to Friday. So we would happily pick up the phone to somebody and just talk and help signpost if we can. So, often it's about providing them with that understanding and that kind of maybe the next step they can take. Sometimes it's actually building a goal in and saying, do you know what, you can ring back next week if you want to, or you can ring back in 2 days if you want to. I mean, we're very, very supportive on the end of the phone. And so that would be something else you could do. I mean, there are other eating disorder charities as well. There's also Samaritans and Mind. And, there's lots of different people you can call if you don't feel able to actually just look for somebody yourself to start with. When you start looking on the internet, you have to be very, very careful about qualifications. So this was a big problem. This is one of the biggest problems, particularly with nutrition, that anybody can call themselves a nutritionist. Anybody. So to a degree, Tina, you sitting here talking to me, listening to me, after all this information, having read my book, you could actually call yourself a nutritionist if you wanted to, because it's not a regulated or protected term in the UK. And while there are registered nutritionists, and they are absolutely legit, there are many, many people that are not registered nutritionists. And so I would say for something like this, particularly eating disorders, you probably do need to look for a specialist dietitian who actually works in the field of eating disorders and disordered eating more than anything else. And again, there are some good governing bodies you can look at. So within Orthorexia, the book kind of listed both the American and the UK equivalents, and so hopefully that will help people to kind of go to the right places.
Yeah, no, and again, just what you were saying, for anyone listening, there is a lot of resource for you to kind of see in the book if you are kind of confused. And again, Nancy Clark gave a website you can use if you are in the US, but I would definitely recommend looking at the book because it's got other kind of options, especially as I mentioned with like types of therapists. Do you need a counselor? Do you need a psychologist? What are the different things? So definitely check that out. And what about someone who's listening who is maybe seeing some things they might have noticed in a loved one? Like, how can you bring this up without them kind of feeling like you're attacking them, or that, you're kind of worrying about them when you should just be worrying about yourself?
And that's such a brilliant question. And it's one that I get asked so much. And the only thing you can do is try and have a conversation and help them to understand that what they're doing to themselves is actually not right, and get them to try and be open. And if you can, give them examples, like say, you know what, I know you're trying to do what's right for you. I completely believe that. But actually, look at you. You're tired. You don't want to go out with your friends anymore. You don't want to sit with us even for dinner. And surely you must be missing that. And it's kind of not about blame. It's actually about saying, look, I understand that something's not right here and I want to support you. Tell me what I can do to help you. Let me provide you. And it might be, say, I don't have the answers, but together we'll find the people that do. We can work on this together. And I think it's actually about being able to show them compassion, show them support, show them that you care, show them that you love them, show them how good they really are. And again, as you've pointed out in Orthorexia, I've tried to provide some exercises that people can do to try and boost their confidence, or at least to sort of see how they perceive themselves and how they perceive others. And it might be that actually someone who's a loved one is caring actually would maybe try and do some of those exercises with their loved one, to sort of maybe try some of those. So it can just be simple things, and it's not about blame. It's not about saying there's something wrong with you, we need to sort you out. It's actually like, I can see you're suffering, I can see you're struggling. We can't go on holiday even because you worry about this. Or I think there's something you can always kind of bring it back to that actually will resonate with them. Okay.
All right, great. Thank you. So helpful there. And before we get on to a message from our sponsors and just get to the Running for Real 4, there's so many other things I wanted to ask you about, but I just want to be conscious of your time. And the one question I wanted to ask you before we get to the sponsor round is a question that maybe you've been thinking about a bit lately with writing a book. I know you get like a foreword, but if you were to give an Oscar speech, who would you thank?
Oh my goodness.
Or some kind of, acceptance speech.
Who would I thank? I think, that's a really, really difficult question. There's so many people. Yeah, exactly. There are so many people in my life that I would thank. I would definitely thank my children. My girls have been amazing, and they actually really helped keep me grounded. And they're fantastic. But I've also got such a very close-knit set of friends that that actually, especially like I said, over the last year, they literally have been my rock. And I won't name them because they'll know who they are. But I've probably got a group of 6-7 friends that without them, I don't think this book would have been written, to be fair.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So that would be where my acceptance speech would have to go.
Okay, that's great. All right, we're just going to take a moment to thank our sponsors, and we'll be back with the Running for Real 4. It's pretty clear by now that today is a serious episode, and it's something that needs to be discussed. As runners, we care about our performance, and we have to make sure we're eating nutritious, good foods that help us recover and help us feel good. But we have to balance it out with foods that make us feel good. You know the difference. The ones that we eat when we are with family and friends, the one that we cherish as we make memories with others we love, and of course, those foods that just bring a smile to your face, as they might be naughty, but they're so damn good. Now, the one area you should never really sacrifice your nutrition for is your training and racing. You know, those foods you eat before and during your run. They need to be just what your body needs to serve you best and help you perform when it matters so you actually feel good. Now, Generation UCAN is the only fuel I ever took that actually made me feel good in a sustained way, not like a, Amazon woman 1 minute who can accomplish anything and then 5 minutes later feeling a low so low that I felt like I was going to drop out. Generation UCAN gives you a nice steady energy flow, and it's made from real ingredients, not processed corn syrup like gels, I guess. You can find out more and use coupon code RUNNING4REAL for 15% off at generationucan.com. It's racing season. All those moments of hard work, dedication, early nights are ready to show their worth as race day approaches. For me, though, this was always the time I felt the worst. All those accumulated miles are in your legs, and race day looms, your mind starts to spin into overdrive, wondering, why don't I feel good? And you just don't seem to be recovering. Now, it's hard to overcome, but one trick I had up my sleeve was to take 10 Body Health Perfect Amino. And that allowed me to recover just that little bit faster, enough to convince my mind that I was going to be okay. And after the races, when that soreness leaves you pretty much unable to walk, it was Perfect Amino that I relied on to nurse me back to normal. Well, at least so I could walk normally rather than like I was 150 years old. Now, there was one thing I didn't like about those Perfect Amino tablets, and that was having to swallow 10 in one go. That's no easy feat, but the stubborn runner in me had to do it that way. But now Body Health has created Perfect Amino XP packets containing those 8 amino acids essential to recovery, and as it's a powder, you can add it to any drinks, especially for those moments you can't get a recovery meal in right away. And let's face it, that happens often. Go to bodyhealth.com and remember to use coupon code RUNNINGFORREAL for 10% off. All right, Renee, just 4 more quick questions for you.
Sure.
Actually, I'm wondering if we could do 3.
Yeah.
Well, you can try this first one if you want to, but usually ask a unique nutrition tip, but you have given us quite a lot.
Okay.
So if you want to skip over that one, we can skip over that one. And the second one is a running for real moment, which is a moment where I usually say to people, a moment that only runners will understand, but maybe it's something that, maybe it was that turning point for you when you were at that talk, when you kind of had a very real moment that you wanted, that kind of changed your life forever, really.
I think for me, actually, it is a running moment. It's a moment. It was 4 years ago, I went to Nepal. And I think before then, while running's always been something I've loved, a race was a race. You went to do well. And I got to Nepal, and suddenly it wasn't about a race. It was actually my journey. And it really was a journey of understanding who I was and what running meant to me, but also who was really vital and important in my life. Who did I miss? Who kept me going? But equally, the people of Nepal and how amazing they were and how much hardship they went through, but yet they still kept smiling. And I think it was a real turning point for me. It gave me so much, that trip. I can't even begin to explain it in words. But for me, that will definitely be a highlight without a doubt.
Oh, okay, great. And the next question is a high moment in your career and why it meant so much to you. Maybe that's right now.
Oh, well, I mean, to a point. I think actually, while I'm really proud of many things I've achieved, like I'm really proud of the work I've done, supporting the athletes I supported going into Rio last year. That was a big achievement, going to Rio and being part of a team that won a medal at the Paralympics. That was huge. But I do think for me at the moment, actually being able to provide people with something that can help them, something that can change them, something that can give them, that helps them to care for themselves. To me, being somebody that's being kind of promoted as a bit of an ambassador for that sort of mental health and self-care, that really is my message, very much so.
Oh, I love that. Very, very true. And you are touching so many lives, so I can absolutely see why that would be a high moment. Finally, I ask people what they tell themselves when they're standing on the start line. If you want to use that example, you can. Mm-hmm. But if you prefer to use, you said you do a lot of talks and presentations and you get nervous. Yeah. What do you tell yourself before any situation that kind of brings on that fear and nervousness?
Again, I go back to what I said in the podcast, that you cannot compare yourself to anybody else. You can only know what you know about yourself, and you have to know that what you know now is more than you did a week ago or more than you did 2 weeks ago, because you're presenting something that you've been asked to present. So it's very much that self-talk of, do you know what, you are the expert in this field, that's why you stood up here, and you just have to believe that.
Love that. And that can so easily apply to running as well, because you standing on the start line, you're stronger than you have been ever before, because you've built up more training over the rest of your life than you did last time. So that's great. And finally, I ask my guests to send me a photo of themselves in a power pose, something that you would do to build confidence. I don't know, maybe you did some photos in the kind of promo for your book of you kind of standing there, but will you send us a photo of you in a power pose?
Yes, I will do, definitely. Yeah, no problem.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This was amazing and just so much good information in here. I will put lots of links in the show notes for people to find out more about the book Orthorexia. What is the date that it goes live or goes up for sale?
It's published on the 16th of November.
Okay, so that will be just over a week's time if you are listening to this on Friday, the 8th of November. So make sure you go pre-order that now, and I definitely would encourage it. So thank you so much for coming on the show. This truly means so much.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure, Tina, an absolute pleasure.
This is a bit of an eye-opening episode for many of us, myself included. Now, I saw some behaviours in myself as a previous runner, which are a little worrisome now I look back. But thankfully, after taking my break off and working with Nancy Clark, my relationship with food is a whole lot better. And if you recognise some truths today, maybe it's time to take a look into working with a registered dietitian, or at least listen to that episode with Nancy Clark, which is episode number 25. You can find everything we talked about and a link to that episode at tinamuir.com/episode 33. There's going to be links for Renee's book and other helpful resources that you can use in the show notes. I want to thank you so much for listening today. This is such an important topic, and I hope you will consider sharing it with those you know and love, because you might just be helping them with something that they might not want to admit yet. So next week we have Nicole Detling, who is the owner of Headstrong Consulting, and she's a sports psychologist. Now we're going to break down pre-race, during the race, and post-race mental struggles that we have. And she has fantastic advice for all of us on how to deal with doubt, fear, and of course, lack of confidence. We all deal with that one from time to time. Until then, I hope you have a great week.
Thanks for listening to the Running for Real podcast. Be sure to check out tinamuir.com for show notes and even more helpful running information.